When I discovered I'd been written out of my father's will, not because of something I'd done wrong, but because I refused to lie for my brother in court, the ground beneath my feet didn't just crack. It vanished. It happened in a beige, unremarkable office above a small-town pharmacy. The kind of place where lives quietly shift, one signature at a time. The smell of old carpet and stale coffee clung to the walls. Somewhere in the background, a second hand ticked rhythmically, cutting through the silence like a blade. I sat surrounded by people I once called family, but in that moment, they felt like strangers. My mother stared at the papers in her lap with a kind of practiced detachment, her hands motionless. My brother leaned back in his chair with the same effortless smugness he'd always carried, like nothing in the world could ever touch him. My sister looked as if she wanted to vanish into the wallpaper, caught between discomfort and guilt. And me? I sat frozen. I had known something was wrong the moment the letter from the estate lawyer arrived. It had been too formal, too brief. No warmth. No personal note. Just a date, a time, and an instruction to appear. Still, I showed up. Because I believed in the idea of fairness. I believed in the version of my father who had once told us all that things would be split equally. That we were in this together. That no matter what happened, family would mean something. But as the lawyer read from the newly revised document, the truth unfolded in sharp, cold lines. My name wasn't there. Not a mention. Not even a token gesture. The house. The savings. The company. All of it left to Ryan and Hannah. Everything I thought I knew about where I stood, not just in the will, but in the family, collapsed. It wasn't even the money that mattered. It was what being erased meant. What it said about how they saw me. What I was worth to them, when I chose integrity over convenience. I thought back to the months leading up to that day. The late-night phone calls. The quiet tension in my mother's voice. The sudden way my brother had tried to pull me into his mess, asking me to look the other way, to smooth over some numbers, to help him out. He'd been facing fraud charges, real ones. Not gossip, not exaggeration. He'd taken money from a client, covered it with forged paperwork, and expected me, the family accountant, to lie under oath to save him. I refused. I thought I was doing the right thing. I still believe I did. But that day in the lawyer's office, it became clear, my refusal had cost me everything. The others didn't speak much. They didn't have to. Their silence spoke volumes. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for forgiveness, because it doesn't think it's done anything wrong. They looked through me, over me, around me, as if I'd chosen to step out of the circle, when in reality, they'd pushed me. Outside, the wind bit at my skin as I stepped into the afternoon light. But it wasn't the cold that chilled me. It was the weight of finality. The knowledge that they had chosen convenience over character. That they had drawn a line in the sand, and left me on the other side. I stood on the sidewalk staring out at nothing, trying to steady my breathing, trying to process what had just happened. There were no dramatic arguments. No shouting. Just paper. Paper with ink that made my absence permanent. And yet, even in that moment of hollow disbelief, something inside me began to settle, not in defeat, but in clarity. They had erased me from the story, but that didn't mean I was gone. They had taken my share, but not my truth. And I realized something as I stood there watching the world pass by like it didn't know what had just changed. I didn't need their signature to validate my worth. I didn't need their approval to defend what was right. And I didn't need to stay silent. This wasn't over. Long before the will erased my name, I had already spent a lifetime being quietly sidelined. I was never the loudest voice at the table. Never the one who demanded the spotlight. While others chased applause, I found comfort in order, in numbers that added up, in responsibilities fulfilled, in being the one people could count on, even if they never said thank you. In our family, that role belonged to me by default. I was the middle child, the bridge between Ryan's chaos and Hannah's soft uncertainty. From a young age, I learned how to clean up messes I didn't make. Ryan would charm his way into trouble, and I would quietly patch the holes behind him. Hannah would disappear into anxiety, and I'd make the phone call she was too afraid to dial. Our father built his construction business from scratch. A self-made man with calloused hands and a short temper, he believed in hard work and discipline, at least in theory. But somewhere along the way, that belief became selective. Ryan, with his easy grin and loud confidence, could do no wrong. Even when he did, even when the bank called about the overdrafts or when a project fell behind because Ryan forgot to file permits, Dad would wave it off. He's learning, he'd say. He's just got to find his footing. Meanwhile, I was the one balancing the books. The one who stayed late to fix billing errors, who double-checked supply orders, who reminded Dad when taxes were due. There were no words of praise for those things. Just an unspoken understanding that I'd handle it. That I always would. I didn't resent it. Not at first. It felt like purpose, like being useful had its own kind of power. But over time, it began to feel like invisibility. When Dad passed unexpectedly, the silence in the house was thick. There were no instructions beyond what we'd always been told. Split everything equally. And we believed it. Or at least, I did. I spent the weeks after the funeral helping organize his paperwork, sorting through boxes of old receipts and files. I held my mother's hand at the bank. I comforted Hannah when she cried in the garage. I took care of everything while Ryan was too busy trying to keep his own affairs afloat. It was during that time that I noticed small red flags, bills tied to his name that didn't add up, loans that hadn't been mentioned, withdrawals from the business account for projects I didn't recognize. When I asked questions, Ryan got cagey, dismissive. But I didn't push hard enough. Not then. I wanted to believe he'd grown up, that he was finally stepping into the responsibility he'd always shrugged off. But deep down, I think I knew. I knew that Ryan didn't change. He simply got better at disguising the damage he caused. When the fraud charges came, I wasn't surprised, just disappointed. And when I learned what he expected of me, to lie under oath, to protect him with false financial records, something in me finally broke. It wasn't just about legality. It was about morality. I had spent my whole life doing the right thing quietly. And now, when the truth mattered most, I was being asked to bury it. I refused. And that refusal, that single moment where I chose principle over protection, became the wedge that split everything apart. My mother didn't see it that way. To her, family was sacred. Loyalty trumped truth. She'd rather preserve the illusion than confront the fallout. And Ryan? He just adjusted, shifted his strategy, positioned himself as the victim, the misunderstood son, the one under attack. He played them, and they let him. So when the will was changed, when my name was silently erased, it wasn't just about money. It was the culmination of years of being reliable, responsible, and ultimately disposable. They expected me to take it quietly, because that's what I'd always done. But this time, I wasn't going to disappear into the background. This time, I was going to make sure they saw me, not as the sister who cleaned up behind them, not as the daughter who never asked for anything, but as the woman who had finally decided that her truth mattered. It started with a quiet shift, the kind of change you only notice if you're used to reading between the lines. Ryan, who once moved through life with a reckless kind of ease, suddenly seemed jittery beneath the surface. He started showing up unannounced, lingering longer at Mom's house, asking more questions about the business, about Dad's records, about me. There was a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before, like he was always calculating, always spinning something behind the scenes. I knew trouble was coming long before I knew its shape. Rumors spread fast in small towns. Whispers about a couple who'd hired Ryan's crew to build their dream retirement home. About delays. Money that disappeared. Work that was done poorly or never done at all. I didn't want to believe it. But the details began stacking up, and they pointed in one direction. Something had gone very wrong, and Ryan was trying to hide it. He made his move on a Thursday. It was one of those early spring afternoons where the sun pretends warmth but the wind still bites. I had just finished updating our family's tax files when he called, saying he wanted to meet. No reason, no context. Just urgency, wrapped in charm. When I saw him, I noticed it immediately, the way his smile didn't reach his eyes. The sweat at his collar despite the chill in the air. He came bearing a folder. That folder. He wanted my help. Not in the way families usually ask. A ride, a loan, a shoulder to lean on, but something else. Something much darker. He needed me to verify financial records that I hadn't touched. Documents I hadn't seen. Invoices that didn't match anything in the official ledgers. And he wanted me to stand behind them. Publicly. Legally. He needed me to lie. That moment moved slowly, like time had thickened around us. As I flipped through the pages, I recognized just enough to know they'd been doctored. Carefully, but not perfectly. Ryan had always believed he could talk his way out of anything. And maybe, in the past, that had worked. Maybe I had been part of the machine that let him get away with more than he should have. Cleaning up after him. Covering with silence. But this was different. This wasn't spilled paint on a client's porch. This wasn't an overdraft or a missed deadline. This was fraud. Real, provable, life-altering. And he wanted me to wear it with him. I closed the folder and slid it back toward him. I didn't need time to think. I already knew. There are moments in life that draw invisible lines, moments you step across and know there's no going back. That was one of them. I refused. Not with anger. Not with drama. Just quiet, deliberate certainty. The look in his eyes shifted fast. That mask of casual charm cracked, just for a second, and what was underneath made my stomach turn. Not fear. Not remorse. But contempt. He hadn't come to me hoping. He'd come expecting. And when I didn't play along, something inside him turned cold. I think he knew right then what he'd do next. The fallout came quickly. Not loud, not direct, but slow, corrosive, and calculated. My mother stopped calling as often. When she did, her voice carried a new edge, something brittle and cautious, like she didn't know how to talk to me anymore. My name stopped coming up in family group messages. Hannah grew distant, replying to texts days late, if at all. They didn't confront me. They just drifted. And in their silence, Ryan filled the space. I could feel it, the way he rewrote the narrative behind my back. I imagined the versions he told them. That I was bitter, unhelpful. That I turned my back on him when he needed family most. That I cared more about numbers than blood. They believed him. Or maybe it was easier to. It hurt in a way that defied logic. I wasn't the one who did something wrong, and yet I was the one who paid for it. But I didn't regret my choice. I couldn't. Because integrity doesn't come with applause. It comes with solitude. It comes with the quiet ache of knowing you could have made things easier for everyone, but chose to make them right. And so, the line was drawn. When I didn't cross. When they couldn't forgive. Grief comes in strange forms. I'd already grieved my father when we buried him beneath the frost-hardened ground of late winter. But the grief that followed wasn't about loss. It was about erasure. By the time I sat in the lawyer's office that day, I wasn't naive. Something in me already knew. The way Ryan had been showing up around my mother more than usual. The clipped tone in her voice when we last spoke. The look Hannah gave me in the grocery store aisle, not anger, but avoidance. Like she couldn't bear to make eye contact. Still, knowing something and hearing it are two very different things. There, in that stuffy little room lined with certificates and muted art prints, the confirmation arrived like a blade drawn slowly across my skin. The amended will was brief. Efficient. It named Ryan as primary heir, full rights to the business, the savings, the house. Hannah, too, had been included. A share of assets. The promise of a secure future. My name was absent. Not reduced. Not minimized. Just missing. As if I had never been part of the plan. As if I had never belonged at all. There was no dramatic gesture. No slammed fists or gasps. Just the sound of paper shifting and the quiet scratch of a pen checking notes. But the silence that followed carried a weight I'd never known. And in that moment, I realized what had happened. This wasn't a legal oversight. It was a decision. A calculated, deliberate choice made in the shadow of my refusal. A punishment wrapped in polite legalese. They didn't confront me, they eliminated me. I sat still, unmoving, as the others rose around me. Their faces gave nothing away. Ryan walked out first, back straight, as if he'd just closed a deal. My mother left next, her hands trembling only slightly as she gathered her purse. Hannah hovered for a moment longer, her steps hesitant, but eventually she, too, slipped out without a word. I stayed behind, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I needed to feel the weight of that room, of what it now represented. The walls felt smaller than when I entered. The window overlooking the parking lot was smudged with fingerprints, and for a moment I focused on them, all the lives that had passed through here, changed by the contents of a manila folder. I wasn't surprised, but I was devastated. There's a specific kind of pain that comes from being cut out not for failing your family, but for refusing to fail yourself. For holding to your values when it would have been so much easier to fold. Outside, the air was colder than I remembered. A late breeze carried the last of the spring thaw, but I didn't feel it. I felt nothing. Just an odd, hollow calm. The kind that only comes after everything you believed in stops making sense. At home, I pulled out the original version of the will, the one I'd helped my father organize. I kept it in a box in the hall closet, along with old tax records and business files. I stared at the pages I'd once trusted. My name printed there so clearly, so confidently. I wasn't imagining this. He had wanted me included. And now that version was void. I didn't cry. Not then. Not even later, when I lay in bed, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the street. Tears didn't come, only the slow, relentless pulse of betrayal, like water dripping through a crack in the ceiling you can't seal. I thought of the years I'd spent quietly supporting them, fixing things they never saw. Standing in the background while Ryan stumbled into spotlight after spotlight, each one undeserved. I thought of my mother's silence, of Hannah's retreat, and I thought of how easy it had been for them to pretend I didn't exist. But beneath that ache, something else stirred. Not rage, not even revenge. Resolve. They had written me out with ink and signatures. That didn't mean I was gone. I still had the truth. And I was done staying quiet. Some betrayals are loud, violent outbursts, shouted accusations, broken plates, and slammed doors. This wasn't that. This was quiet. Surgical. The kind of betrayal that moves behind closed doors, dressed in paperwork and false smiles. It didn't scream. It whispered, and that whisper carried weight. But silence, I've learned, can be used both ways. In the days after the will reading, I moved through the world differently. I went to work, answered emails, kept up appearances, but behind that routine was a growing, focused burn. I wasn't going to let this go. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I couldn't live with a version of the story where they got to rewrite what was true. I started by requesting copies of the amended will, the one that removed my name. The ink was clean, the formatting tidy, but something felt off. I still had the original, the version I helped my father prepare. It was signed a full year before his death, reviewed with a lawyer, printed on the same kind of heavy stock paper he insisted on for all things official. His signature there was familiar, firm, centered, but the new one, something about the stroke patterns, the loops, the spacing, it didn't match. I ordered a handwriting analysis from a private specialist. I didn't tell anyone, just sent scanned copies of both signatures along with the dates. A week later, the report came back, inconsistent with known samples. It wasn't definitive proof of forgery, but it was enough to raise questions. At the same time, I started looking deeper into Ryan's finances. Quietly, carefully. My father had taught me well, and Ryan, for all his charm, had never been careful with paper trails. What I found didn't surprise me, but it still hollowed me out. He'd been moving money from business accounts under vague contractor fees and consulting payments. Large withdrawals lined up suspiciously with personal expenses, a new truck, a week at a beach resort, a private gym membership in a town he didn't even live in. And then came the fraud case, the one that had first triggered all of this. The retired couple who'd trusted him to build their final home had filed a civil suit. Misappropriation of funds, incomplete construction, forged documents. The evidence was damning. And still, no one in my family said a word. No apologies. No calls. Just absence. Just that deafening silence that comes when people know they're wrong but are too afraid or too proud to face it. But I wasn't afraid. I sent copies of my financial findings to the couple's lawyer anonymously, along with records that linked those missing funds to Ryan's known accounts. I didn't need to take credit. I just needed the truth to surface. And it did. The civil case turned into a criminal one. Investigators began asking questions. Ryan's name started slipping into local conversations in an entirely different tone. His charm, which once deflected scrutiny like armor, began to fracture under pressure. As that unfolded, I prepared my own case. I filed a formal complaint contesting the will, submitted the handwriting report, collected emails, voicemails, timeline discrepancies, anything that painted the full picture of how my father's final wishes had been tampered with. I wasn't seeking vengeance. I wasn't even seeking compensation. I was fighting for truth, for recognition, for the right to say, you cannot erase me. There was a strange power in that. Quiet, steady, and clean. Some nights I still lay awake, not with rage, but with a kind of focused clarity. I thought about the silence in that lawyer's office, about the way my mother's hands didn't tremble when she left, about the absence of my name, and how carefully it must have been removed. They had underestimated me, because I had spent so long being dependable, predictable, silent. But silence can also be the calm before a storm, and this storm had been building for a very long time. Truth has a rhythm. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arises as a slow, steady tide, rising inch by inch, until the shore you once knew disappears beneath it. For weeks, everything moved quietly. But beneath the surface, pressure was building. Then, like a fault line snapping, everything shifted at once. The forgery report triggered a formal investigation. The lawyer who had overseen the revised will was summoned for questioning. His answers were vague, and the notary logs didn't match the date of the signature. Discrepancies emerged. Timelines blurred. The pristine edges of Ryan's version of events began to peel away. At the same time, The fraud case against him deepened. The retired couple who'd trusted him to build their last home came forward with more evidence. His bank records, now obtained through subpoena, told a story he couldn't spin his way out of. Every lie he'd woven was unraveling. And still, the most painful part wasn't the headlines or the legal filings. It was the way my mother reacted when the truth could no longer be denied. Not with horror, not with apology, but with heartbreak for him. She didn't rush to defend me. She didn't question how far he'd gone. She didn't ask how long I'd been carrying this alone. She simply mourned the image she'd held of her son. Even then, I remained the afterthought. But Hannah changed. Slowly. She started to reach out, not with grand confessions or apologies, but with long pauses in our conversations. With emails asking for copies of documents. With questions she hadn't been brave enough to ask before. Eventually, she told me she had suspected something was off, but didn't want to be the one to say it aloud. Fear had kept her quiet. Family had kept her compliant. But fear was no longer enough to silence her. She filed her own claim, one to protect her share from being tied up in Ryan's lawsuits. And in doing so, she finally stepped away from the role of passive bystander. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. As for Ryan, his world cracked open fast. Contracts were canceled. His name, once synonymous with charm and confidence, became linked to courtrooms and scandal. The reputation he had worked so hard to maintain shattered under the weight of his own shortcuts. He tried to spin it, of course. Blame the economy. Blame the system. Even blame me. But none of it stuck. Not anymore. The legal case surrounding the will concluded quietly, in a cold courtroom with flickering lights and hard wooden benches. The original version, the one I'd helped my father draft, was reinstated. The revised will was deemed fraudulent, and the lawyer who had filed it was formally reprimanded. My name returned. Not as an apology, but as a correction. But the damage had already been done. What I had lost wasn't just property or money. It was the sense of belonging I had once held so tightly. Even after the court ruling, I never stepped foot back into my mother's house. The threshold felt foreign now, a place built on years of quiet compromises and unspoken favoritism. She called once. Left a message. Her voice was fragile, full of trembling nostalgia and regret. But it was too late for that kind of softness. Too much had been buried for too long. I didn't return the call. Instead, I focused on rebuilding. Not just legally, but emotionally. I updated the business name on my father's old company registry. Repainted the sign above the door. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. It was time to stop trying to hold onto the version of the past that had never truly included me. Each day, I stepped into the office with clearer eyes. I no longer waited for recognition. I didn't need it. There was freedom in finally understanding where I stood, not in the family mythology, but in reality. I had chosen truth. And the truth, even when it strips everything bare, still leaves you something solid to stand on. Time doesn't heal all wounds. Some don't scab over, they simply stop bleeding. And even then, the ache lingers, sudden and sharp, in the quiet moments you don't expect. Months have passed since the courtroom faded behind me. Since the headlines died down, since Ryan's name stopped bouncing around like a cautionary tale in town gossip. The storm is over. The wreckage remains. But I survived it. Not by becoming someone else, but by becoming more myself than I'd ever been allowed to be. My days are slower now, quieter. I arrive at the office early, sometimes before the sun crests the edge of the trees outside my window. There's something sacred in the silence, not the silence of betrayal, but the silence of peace. There are no more voicemails from Ryan. No texts from my mother trying to rewrite history with soft words and selective memory. Hannah reaches out now and then, mostly short messages, sometimes longer ones that arrive late at night. She's still figuring it out. I let her. I'm not angry anymore. Not like I was. What replaced the anger wasn't forgiveness, it was understanding. I understand now how easy it is to follow the path of least resistance. How loyalty can be twisted into guilt. How love can be confused with silence. And how truth, even when it's sharp and unwelcome, is still the only thing that holds. I live alone, but I don't feel alone. Not in the way I used to. Not surrounded by people who smiled through gritted teeth and looked away when it mattered. I've built something steadier than that. My office walls are lined with framed blueprints my father once sketched. I kept them, not for nostalgia, but as a reminder. He taught me how to build. He just didn't teach me what was worth keeping upright. That lesson, I had to learn on my own. And now, every time I look at my name on the company letterhead, etched clearly where it always should have been, I feel something I thought I'd lost forever, belonging. Not to them, to myself. Some nights, I still think about the will. About the weight of those pages, how easily they tried to erase me with ink and pressure and inheritance politics. And I think about how close I came to disappearing, not from a document, but from myself. But I didn't. I didn't vanish. I didn't fold. I stood. Alone, yes, but upright. It turns out, you don't need to be invited to the table when you can build your own. That knowledge sits with me like armor now. Not heavy, just present, quiet and certain. People still ask sometimes about the case, about Ryan, about whether my family ever reached out. I never give them much. Not because I don't want to share, but because there's a power in what I've kept for myself. Not every story needs an audience. Some just need an ending. And mine, it's not tidy. Not clean. But it's true. I still see them around town sometimes. My mother at the post office, Hannah in the parking lot outside the pharmacy. We nod. Sometimes we smile. Nothing more. And that's all right. Some bridges don't burn. They just collapse under the weight of too many unspoken truths. What matters is that I'm on solid ground now. And for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid of the silence. Because in that silence, I finally heard myself.